Exactly. There you go. So you can just turn it off and then you can leave it right here when you're done.
Okay. And then...
So usually that goes in a pocket.
Yes, it does, and I foolishly wore exactly the wrong dress.
Well, you know, dresses, these things are maybe they're high.
No, they're not.
It's very sexy. Yeah, that's exactly what I do. And then do you feel prepped?
I'm all good.
All right, cool. The recording's all ready to go. So one thing I'll remind you of for the recording, the only audio that gets recorded is what's said in the microphone. And so at the end, if people are asking you questions, you have to repeat that back. Cool. Excellent.
Okay, well, I guess we can start here. So I think we'll get started here. Marla. I have the pleasure of introducing our Grand Round speaker today. And it's especially exciting to introduce Glynis Shea because she brings great skill and expertise and a perspective that we usually don't have here at Pediatric Grand Rounds. So we've been fortunate in the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Health to have Glynis as our communications coordinator since 2001. She currently is the communications director for the Konopka Institute for Best Practices in Adolescent Health and the Healthy Youth Development Prevention Research Center, both of which sit in our division within the Department of Pediatrics. So Glynis brings to her work with young people, and those of us who work with young people, a background in communications and advertising in a completely different arena. So for 10 years, she was vice president at Saatchi & Saatchi Advertising in San Francisco, where her clients included Hewlett-Packard, U.S. West, and Blue Diamond Almond Growers. Here at the University of Minnesota, Glynis uses her expertise to translate research to practice through communication strategies and products. She also shares her knowledge by going around the country. She's done hundreds of workshops and trains others how to build public support by communicating effectively about young people, particularly around health disparities and sexual health. For her work, Glynis was awarded Advocate of the Year by the Minnesota Organization on Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention and Parenting. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Glynis to present health disparities in pediatrics. What can you do about it?
Thank you. Thank you, Iris. How's my sound check? Got me in the back? Excellent. That little bit about Advocate of the Year, I don't usually put that in. She did that. That was so nice. Thank you. As you probably figured out from that introduction, we are going to talk about what you can do about health disparities in pediatrics, but we're going to talk about it from a communications perspective today. And I'm not addressing it from a communications angle on how you as pediatricians interact with your patients, as much as I am talking about how we collectively talk about health disparities in pediatrics to the world, to the public. And you can see from this ad that I have up here kind of what I'm getting at. And yes, I understand you all don't run ads all the time. This is a public health ad, and you're going to hear more about sort of the public health orientation of my work. But take a look at the ad that I have up here. You can see that's a pretty shocking visual, right? We've got the vulture sitting on the baby carriage. And the headline reads, "Black infants are twice as likely to die before their first birthday as their white counterparts." And it goes on, our community is facing a crisis, we need to do something, etc. What I'm going to share with you today is based on communications research that reveals that this kind of message does exactly the opposite of what we intend it to do. As opposed to sort of inspiring action, hitting people in the gut, motivating them to do things. Instead, this kind of message reinforces the existing beliefs and perceptions people have about this issue, which unfortunately are not productive for our cause. So that's where we're going today. Again, you might imagine that this is going to be something very, very different. Right? Nimi calls this the grand rounds, now for something different. So I brought with you my most favorite different thing of the past week. Has anybody ever seen this before? Conehead cabbage. Who knew? Farmer's market, it's waiting for you, your own conehead cabbage. I had to look it up. I got the scientific name for you guys. Supposedly sweeter than your average cabbage. So this is going to be different. You can already tell I'm trying to make jokes. You're laughing, so that's good. I'm going to ask you to talk to me, talk to your neighbor. I'm really more of a trainer than I am a speaker. So strap in, get ready for the ride. Because the other thing I have to confess to you all, I have an agenda. I really do. And on highfalutin days, it's nothing short of changing the world. But what I mean by that is my agenda is to stand behind young people as they try to change the world. And I believe it's our collective responsibility in this youth-serving community to support that. And I think one of the ways, because I'm an ex-advertiser, to do that is to talk about this stuff. And this is particularly important for you all. I am super nervous today. Like I said, I do public speaking. I talk to like hundreds of people at a time. But you all are doctors, right? And so I'm like nervous. And it's that nervousness that is also why I think you all are one of the best standard bearers for these messages that I can think of. I mean, honestly, you are the celebrity spokesmodels of this field, okay? Maybe you don't have the startling good looks of a Brad Pitt, right? Or the charisma of Oprah, or the geeky following of our friends from Star Trek, but you all have something that people listen to. And I'm hoping today to sort of tap you into some of the messages we can use so you can leverage that authority and that power. The other thing that makes me nervous, but now I'm feeling a lot calmer, is that with this agenda, sort of comes my values and my interests and my issues. And the fact that you all came today with the sort of heading of Pediatrics and Disparities, what can you do about it? That tells me that everybody in this room has at least a little bit of interest in doing something about this issue. So thank you. Okay, I'm still breathing good. That's good. Here's another thing that's making me nervous about today. When we talk about health disparities, there is one big central issue that folks are loath to discuss, and that would be the issue of racism. And I am absolutely going to go there today. So I'm all freaking out. I'm like, oh, how am I going to do this? Talk about racism. I start reading your journals. I'm like, okay, just calm down. Take a look. Are they talking about it? And surely you are. Right? This was not the only article or policy brief on this topic. So I'm feeling, okay, this group is interested. They are talking about these things. But I wanted to give you that fair warning because I know you got your sandwich, and if this is not good for you, you can run now. That's okay, because there's lots of people here, so that's good. Any questions before we start? All right. You heard my introduction. I just want to do 30 seconds on where I come from. Iris is the head of our division of general pediatrics and adolescent health, and the group I work with and most closely affiliate with is the Konopka Institute for Best Practices in Adolescent Health. Other than my division friends, has anybody here heard of Gisela Konopka? Division friends. Ooh, I see a face I don't recognize. What do you know of Gisela Konopka? Yeah, that's you. From her work in adolescents, right. So she's kind of nationally renowned expert on adolescent health. She was very focused on girls. She was a researcher and an advocate and a youth worker. I mean, literally up to her passing, she was going and working with young people. And so we follow in her footsteps. You can see her mission here. My work is funded by the federal government, our federal government. I'm funded through HRSA MCHB as part of the State Adolescent Health Resource Center. This is where we support public health people in adolescent health positions in the states, and also the Centers for Disease Control's Prevention Research Center. I have a lot of colleagues in the audience today. I just want to give a shout out. Thank you for coming, colleagues. But the part of my background that makes me sort of the square peg is the time I spent in advertising. And my colleagues are very patient with me because I come from a different world and talk about things very differently. And I've also, I believe, begun to accept that I might have something different to add to the party. And that's from the advertiser's orientation. I got my job at an ad agency right out of college. I had been a secretary, so I got a job typing at this small ad agency. They were only unique in that they had this client who was building computers in their garage. And this was Hewlett-Packard. And as Hewlett-Packard became more and larger, so did the ad agency. So by the time I left, I was a vice president with the Hewlett-Packard global account in the largest ad agency in the world. So that was quite the ride, and it was super formative, right? I can't shake where I came from. So that's sort of the perspective that I'm bringing to you today. And I wanted to tell you I brought you a handout, because I'm sure you copiously take notes in grand rounds. Is that true? Oh, yeah, I see some nods, I see some humor. Okay, so here this is. On the back, perhaps more relevant to you, are the citations. I am not a researcher. I think we've established that. I am not a doctor either. But the work that I read, translate into practice for you all, that's all right here. Okay, I'm also going to cite a couple of examples, and this is where it became interesting for me thinking about you all as practitioners, because most of my examples focus on public health. So I'm going to keep those in so you see how this applies that way, but I'm also challenging you to think about where does this intersect with your stuff. So the first piece here is from our local teen pregnancy prevention, now sexual health organization. They used to be called MOAP, and now they're called TeenWise. And the second is a product I helped develop with the state of Minnesota's HIV/STD division on chlamydia. So I've been talking for a long time. I've already told you we're going to talk about rough subjects. I just want to go there immediately and give you what I believe is sort of the goal for my presentation, and that is for you to engage in conversations like this. Here is the Shea family sitting outside enjoying one of our summer afternoons, evenings, in the great state of Minnesota, drinking adult beverages from large red plastic cups, as you can see. And I'm talking to my aunt across the table. And she's like, oh, you do that public health stuff. Gosh, I saw something in the newspaper about infant mortality and that how the U.S. is like really bad at this, and that it's really about those people. How can those mothers let that happen? How can those mothers be such bad? How can those people be such bad mothers? So, what do I say? What do you say? Will you turn to your neighbor? Talk about it. I'm giving you 2 minutes. What do you say when someone says something like this in front of you? What do you say? 2 minutes. Okay, could you wrap up? I'm going to start again. All right. Thanks for doing that. Appreciate it. I'm not going to ask you to join in the conversation, but I am going to share with you what I hear most frequently, because I do this a lot. The most common and also recommended come back to this sort of comment is a question. What do you mean by those people, Auntie? What do you mean by those people? Did anybody go there? Question, clarifying question, right? It's a great strategy because it gives Auntie a minute to check herself, right? B, it doesn't make the assumption that Auntie is making some kind of racist comment, although probably she is, right? And C, it starts a conversation as opposed to being on the attack immediately, right? So asking that question, awesome strategy. Some other responses I frequently receive are, yeah, I would say nothing. I would say nothing. Which, again, I'm a Minnesotan. I get that. I do. That said, though, if you embrace my strategy that we are spokespeople for these issues, saying nothing is agreement. Right? So the trick, I believe, for this is to have that response prepared. Right? Be ready to say, hey, what do you mean by those people? So that you're not spitting out whatever beverage that is in the big red plastic cup when it happens. To be ready. So there's great resources about this if you want to pursue it further. But I bring this up because this is exactly the kind of situation that I think we all confront. Has anyone never had something like this happen to them? No hands, in case you're wondering. Okay. So moving on to why this happens and how we can deal with it. Because having a ready response is stage one, and saying something is stage one. But stage two, the accelerated version, and I'm rolling that out for you all because I think you're ready, is to change the nature of the conversation away from being focused on bad mothers and bad individuals to the larger systems and structures that either support great mothering or bad mothering or whatever kind of mothering we want to talk about. That's like the advanced thing. So that's where I want to try to get with you today. The work that I'm talking about comes from my advertising background, but there's actually big communications theory behind it. I'm not rolling out the communications textbook for you today. I'm showing you a definition from Wikipedia that I kind of liked. I know that, again, might be a violation, but there it is. In fact, this definition doesn't even exist on Wikipedia anymore, so, and it's still garbled. But here's sort of the bottom line with this. Framing, and you get this clue from the people they cite here, psychologists, linguists, and cognitive scientists. This idea of framing messages is something that happens in your brain. It's not an intentional function. And the communications researchers who look at this talk about how because your brain is so powerful and takes in so much information, what it does is makes mental shortcuts. So it takes in information, it links it to what you already know, so you can move on to the next bit of processing. And again, I'm not escaping the irony of the advertising executive addressing physicians about brain functioning. We'll just put that aside for now. So mental shortcuts. That's really the way to think about it. Here are Glynis definitions. A frame is just what's in your head that drives how you think and react to something. And framing your story or framing your message, is how you deal with that. But really, the big thing you need to remember, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is you are always being framed. Any mediated message is framing content for you. The spokesperson for the President of the United States spends a lot of time thinking about how they're going to frame the answers to the questions about, shall we say, Benghazi, so that you will think about that in the right way. All newspaper articles are framing content for you. In fact, there's another whole field of communication studies that really analyzes how this works and how it's effective. Naturally, all advertising is framing. We called it positioning, the battle for your mind. That was one of our key textbooks when I was going through. But it's all really about knowing how you think and tapping into it to move you forward. And of particular relevance to us in this community is how framing occurs with policy. There's a famous cognitive linguist named George Lakoff. He used to be associated with Berkeley Media Studies Group. Anybody? George Lakoff? All right, everyone in the front. Excellent. He, as one of his great examples, talks about tax relief as being a very rigid frame for discussing the issue of taxes. Tax relief frames the issue of taxes. How does this work, right? It's simple description. Does anybody not feel that it would be nice to have a little bit of relief from taxes? I mean, I think we'll agree there. But what does it evoke? What does that phrase tax relief evoke? You start asking yourself, so are taxes good or bad? Probably bad, right? Because you want to be relieved. You can almost physically see it, right? I'm burdened. I'm weighed down by these taxes. Again, arguably true. What is not being discussed, though, when our discussion about taxes is just about tax relief? What's outside of our frame suddenly? Any thoughts? Yeah, Trina. What the taxes are doing, that would be correct, right? We're not discussing what taxes pay for. We're not discussing about sidewalks or parks or garbage collection or clean running water or fabulous schools or public health system. We're not talking about any of that. We're just talking about tax relief. That's the power of framing and understanding how these frames work. George Lakoff goes on to give an example about an elephant. And this is kind of funny because the elephant is the example, and it's not really relevant, the elephant, so it's kind of like, why is the elephant even here? But I have a picture of an elephant too, so can we just back up? Can you just forget that elephant thing? Can you? No elephants? Can you just remove the elephant from the back and I'll get off the slide? You're not thinking about elephants now, are you? No? No, come on, don't think of the elephant. All right, so this is a little joke that George Lakoff does, probably better than me, because he titled his book, Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values, and Frame the Debate. And this, but just to be clear, this is a political book. I'm not endorsing this as a political book, but I want to illustrate how framing is so impactful. And he does this with the elephant, because the minute I say elephant, because of the mental shortcut, right, you have the elephant in your head. And I'm not going to leave anything to chance, so I put the picture up there, right? And when I protest and say, no, don't think of the elephant, can you really stop thinking of the elephant? No. Once I trigger that elephant is there, and no matter how much I protest, in fact, every time I say it, the elephant is getting bigger and bigger and bigger in your head. That's how these frames and framing work. The power of words is amazing, and I'm sure you experience that in your clinical interaction with patients, right? Are there certain words and phrases that perhaps trigger a response that is not particularly useful to you? I would imagine yes. So that's the thing to remember about frames and framing. And the other thing Lakoff talks about is how this whole elephant thing, now that we've been talking about it for a while, that's going to color how you hear other words I bring up, right? If I say trunk, what are you thinking? Elephant trunk, right? You're not thinking the giant trunk of materials I brought over here today. That's how this works. So framing is critical. I'm sure you have elephants. I want to share with you one of mine. When the researchers started to try to understand why it is that adults hate teenagers, they figured out that one word was a giant elephant, and that is the word teenager. When we say teenager, it triggers a mental shortcut that makes most adults think about this kid. Now, in my community, we're like, wait a minute, that's Tony. He's the valedictorian of his class. Why are you making fun of Tony? But to many adults, Tony is scary. And to make matters worse, again, in my community, how do we refer to Tony in terms of public health audiences? Tony is an at-risk youth. Right? So if Tony the teenager is scary, what is Tony the at-risk youth? So there are recommended reframes. Here they are. Instead of teenager, young people. Instead of at-risk youth, we talk about all youth. That's a different workshop. I just wanted to give you an example. Bottom line about this framing stuff. The words you choose are going to trigger shortcuts. And here's the big one. The shortcuts that you trigger are always going to trump any presentation of facts that you have. The frame always trumps the facts. There is a way out. And that's what these communications research spend a lot of time working on, is if the shortcut is to go this way, are there things we can do to lead people into a different direction? And I want to be clear, this is not about lying, right? That path is going to end up on your topic one way or another. The question is, how do you get there? Communications researchers, lots of them. If you dig this stuff, it's on the back of your worksheet. Two things. This is not bench or clinical research. It's not even public health research. It's largely qualitative. It's focus groups. These are not opinion polls. They really don't care about your opinion. They want to know how you get to your opinion, and that's what these folks study. Are their samples going to be statistically representative? Absolutely not. In fact, it's probably going to skew middle-class white people. So I just want to be aware that that's out there. Here's an example of how this works. Back in the day, the Frameworks Institute was working for the environmental movement. Those of you who are my age or older probably remember hole in the ozone, oh my God, we're all going to die. Do you remember that? That was the message back in the early days from the environmental movement. And what the researchers came back and said is, you know what, that crisis thing is not working. Right? Crisis messages do not compel action. In fact, they compel the opposite. It's like, oh, hole in the ozone, we're all going to die? Guess it's time for me to cook dinner because I can at least do that. Right? So their recommendation is to really focus your talk and your communication on solutions and what is working. And here's a publication from the National Campaign. Many of you might have seen Sarah Brown next week, focused on solutions when it comes to teen pregnancy. So in talking to my public health friends, I suggest let's not be all teen pregnancy is an epidemic in Texas. Instead, let's talk about things like, we know how to do this. We know what works to support sexual health. And in fact, we can do it. We're Texans. We can make that happen. Okay, I know there's irony in that example, given what's happening around reproductive rights in Texas right now. But there it is. The TeenWise organization that I was talking about, they've already done this, right? We collaborate a lot with them. And one of the things they do is publish annual statistics around sexual health, teen pregnancy rates, STD, HIV, all those rates. So they call me up, they're like, hey, let's talk about how we can frame this publication. And my answer to them is, yeah, how about if you don't do that publication? Because honestly, with the way our rates look in Minnesota, there's really not much we can do to kind of minimize the impact of all that bad data. And so they say, well, that's our job. That's what we have to do, Glynis. So we talked about it. And one of the things we did to deal with this implication was to take the recommendations from the back of the publication and put them on the front. Because suddenly it's, oh, here's all the things we could and should be doing. And then you go into the data that is doom and gloom and disaster, and heavily focused on disparities, which is why I was concerned about putting this stuff out as is. Why is this the case, right? Why is it that people interpret this information so focused on the individual? And what these framers talk about is that this concept of individualism, they refer to it as the first language of Americans. Right? Our first instinct is to think about any issue or topic in terms of us as individuals and the world as being a collection of individuals. That is not to say that as Americans we don't believe in or value interconnection. We do. But this is our first instinct. This is our automatic shortcut. And the belief here really is that, success in America depends on taking personal responsibility, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and really making the right choices. And again, these things are in large part true, but they're only one part of the story. So individualism is a challenge. And that's why the framers come back to us and say, folks, if you're going to talk about these things, you need to know that demonstrating unequal outcomes is not a compelling message for action. Folks reading the morbidity mortality reports or the youth risk behavior survey are not going to look at that and think, wow, we collectively as a society should be doing something about that. They're going to read it and think, wow, those kids are messed up. Why can't those kids get it together? That's the interpretation. This is again from the Berkeley Media Studies Group. When you say something like, wow, Group X really suffers from a higher rate of infant mortality than Group Y, their reaction is the same as my auntie. Wow, those moms need to get it together. How can there be such bad moms? This is the shortcut. This is what happens. So when we look at this sort of vital statistics report, and this is what I was talking about with my TeenWise friends, right? You can see, oops, here's a better version of the chart close up. Boy, what's the first read off of this chart? I don't know, can you read it? Boy, that highest level right there is non-Hispanic black, right? Followed by American Indian or Alaskan Native. So whose fault is infant mortality? That would be black moms. that, again, I'm saying this to express the point. That is how this chart would be interpreted by most Americans. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is another phenomena referred to like scientifically as the fundamental attribution error. And I call it, for my own self, environmental blindness. They've done these studies, and what they do is they show people kids playing basketball. In the first video of kids playing basketball, it's terrible. The kids are missing all the baskets, the ball's rolling away, they can't dribble or pass. In the second one, they're great. They make all the shots, they look like a team, it's fabulous. They say, what's the difference? Why are those kids good and those kids bad? And the answers are things like, oh, well, those kids practice harder, they have better talent, that sort of stuff. And folks don't realize or notice that the kids that are playing badly are playing in a completely unlit gymnasium. They're not recognizing that they're playing in the dark. Again, it's something about how our brain functions, tend to ignore the environmental and focus on the individual, unless, of course, it's about yourself. Right? I mean, think about it. You're walking on the street and you trip in a crack in the sidewalk. What are you like, oh, there's a crack in that sidewalk. Somebody should fix that. Right? But if your friend does it, well, you're like, oh, wow, bad footwear choice. That was a mistake. Or, geez, you sure are clumsy. That's how this fundamental attribution error works. So environmental blindness. And what that results in for us is the public, folks looking and not recognizing that if you are a young person, or anybody for that matter, waking up in the morning, leaving your house to go to school from this place versus this place makes a big difference. A big difference in life experience. So, here again, this is the number one framing recommendation I want you to walk home with. And that is, in all our communications, what we need to do is emphasize the systems and the structures and the environmental issues at play around the health topics we want to discuss. Do you see that little red X with the word clinicians next to it? That's where I'm like, how are clinicians going to respond to that? Because I know your job is like super individual focused. So again, I'm not suggesting that this is something within your one-on-one individual clinical practice that's of concern. Maybe it is. I'm not the pro on talking about that. I know there's some radical stuff that your field is taking up to kind of get to this. But I am talking about when you're talking to other people about what it is we do or what is impacting the health issues that are so salient and trenchant when we talk about health disparities. Again, here's some of the language that I coach my public health friends on. Instead of really emphasizing the risk behaviors of young people, I want to talk about the hidden health factors that impact the life odds of young people. All that stuff in quotes there, and I lost my citation. This is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Those quotes are tested language to see if you can avoid that shortcut and channel people into a different way of thinking about these issues. So that's tested language. The next one, not tested, totally made up. The first statistic is not made up. 1 out of 4 young girls has an STI. That's really not the kind of data I want to see us promoting out into the world to talk about these issues. The second bullet point is what does sort of start to evoke the systems and structures. And again, totally made this up. 80% of physicians do not offer STD screening to patients under 18. But I don't know, it may not be that far away. Thoughts? Not too far away. Anyway, so again, getting at the systems and the structures. Why does this happen? And maybe calling out physicians wasn't the right way. Maybe clinics would have been better to look at it from a structural standpoint. Do you see where I'm going? How this is sort of shifting the conversation here? Excellent. Here's how you could do it in publications. Again, back to that teen-wise. You can see on the left is the birth rates, and again, we're going to have those high bar charts. The new way that teen-wise is thinking about doing it is to show those statistics contrasted to some social issue statistics. So in addition to birth rates in the state of Minnesota and STI rates, I think it's chlamydia, we also have a chart that shows dropout rates and poverty levels. So you can start to see the intersection of environment and structure with health outcomes. Sadly, they can't get this kind of data anymore. So, how does this apply to you? You're not public health people, you're not putting out that sort of stuff. I recognize, though, that you do participate in your professional associations around pediatrics, you publish journal articles, etc. And some folks are going there. Some folks are studying it from this angle. And again, I know that's not necessarily your focus or area of expertise, despite your interest in disparities. But what I would suggest is, when you're going into topical issues around disparities, that you at least include some discussion around these environmental factors. Don't you have that like discussion implications section there at the end? That would be an ideal place to bring up some of the larger implications, both from policy or environmental or status discussions. All right, that was as close as I'm going to get to telling you all within your field what I'm thinking, but there it is. All right, so here we were. The third point to all this, how we frame disparities and why it's so treacherous and dangerous. If American public has a hard time seeing that the life lived in these two circumstances is different, what about this one? Do Americans appreciate the fundamental difference that a white young person or a white person would experience versus a person of color, in this case an African American person? Do Americans appreciate that? And frankly, the answer is no. Right? The communication researchers have revealed from their work that Americans largely believe racism kind of done. We have an African American president. Okay, wait. There is some racism, but it's usually like just one or two bad people that still have those perceptions. The idea that structures or systems have some sort of racism inherently built into them or are perpetuated doesn't exist. That's what the research indicated. Truly, though, people of color are experiencing the world very differently than white people are. And the Trayvon Martin case is an excellent and sad and disgusting example of that. Here's a poll from Reuters. Who thinks Trayvon was innocent and unjustly killed? And again, I know the frame trumps the facts, but this data is pretty startling. And you've seen it too in the reactions to the verdicts as well, have you not? So the third point to this sort of challenge around discussing disparities is how we discuss and understand racism. And part of the problem and confusion here is, again, a phenomenon that's inside us. And that's this concept of implicit bias. Has anybody heard of this one before? A little bit in the back. Harvard has done this study to really quantify our implicit bias. And you can go to this website, right, and they have this methodology where they can test where does your bias lie. And one of them, the one I'm going to show you in a second, is white versus African American. And there's a whole method there. But there's many. There's young people versus middle-aged people. The one I just saw was people who are tan versus people who are pale. I don't know, but they're using this methodology to kind of measure one's level of implicit bias. And usually I don't show this, but when you do the whole thing and go through it, they will come up and tell you where your bias lies. I covered mine up because I was shy. But here's the results, though. And I don't know, again, can you read this? The bar chart here, starting at the top, is strong automatic preference for white people compared to black people. This is all of the results. This is from everybody who's ever taken this test. The next one, moderate automatic preference for white people compared to black people. Slight automatic preference for white people compared to black people. Little to no automatic preference between white and black people. Back to this ad. Can you see now how this ad could really reinforce some of the existing mental shortcuts and not lead us into fertile ground for a conversation around the issues for disparities, right? Because again, the reading of this ad would tend to be, wow, those black mothers really need to get it together. And it's for those reasons that the leading nonprofit organizations in the country who are concerned with disparities have done tons of research on how do we get there? How do we have these conversations? And this is one of their big reports, and it's on your citations list here. And what they come back with is all of the words in that red box are words that are going to trigger elephant-like mental shortcuts, right? You talk about racism or white privilege, the general response is going to be, yeah, sorry, not anymore. Post-racial America. White privilege doesn't exist, right? Historical experience, way too far in the past. Slavery was long time ago. Why are we still discussing it? Does this sound familiar? And I hope you pick up my semi-sarcastic tone here, right? Health equity, equality, disparities, that's not relevant. It's about the individual and individual choices, unjust and unjust. This is America. We have a justice system. It's the same for everybody. And finally, poverty, income level. You've heard this one. My grandpa came here. He was poor. He made his way, blah, 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 right? Again, back to individual responsibility and ability to get anywhere based on the individual. So what they're suggesting is don't use those words. That's going to trigger the wrong shortcut. What they do suggest, and I'm going to suspect that you've probably run into this and maybe not even been aware of it, is to talk about things in terms of place, right? Here's a bunch of the language that they tested. So instead of making it about a race or a racial ethnic group, to talk about place and places. Your neighborhood or school should be hazardous to your health. Our opportunities for health begin where we live, learn, work, and pray. Play, pray, either, right? Again, people are taking this language now, adapting it, and using it. And if you start looking at the documents about disparities, you're going to see this kind of language. Whole websites, videos, PBS series are going to really be focused on the role of place. The last one, your zip code, might be more important than your genetic code. Again, tested for effectiveness. Had a bad reaction from some people when you start talking genetics around issues of race. But again, this is directionally what folks are recommending, and this comes from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they used, again, one of the leading framers in the country. That's why, from a public health perspective, we're looking for data presentations like this. Let's show the information by place, by geography, by zip code. And by the way, while we're at it, we have median household income and life expectancy. Let's put some of those environmental or systemic issues and lay them over our health issues as well. The other thing that they bring up, and I don't usually present this slide because I don't have the kind of audience I have here today. The other way to avoid that mental shortcut around individualism is to talk about the actual biological impacts of racism. There's studies, and again, you probably know this way better than me, that sort of demonstrate what a lifelong experience of stress leads to in terms of health outcomes, both for babies and birth outcomes and mothers and families, et cetera, right? Just some in the news today. So they tested that, and what they learned was when you just talk about the impact of racism in terms of stress, it's easily dismissed. Yeah, well, I'm stressed because I couldn't get my coffee at Starbucks this morning, so really? Am I supposed to take it that seriously? That's how the word stress gets interpreted. So the framers here, and this is Cultural Logic, again, on your references, suggest that we talk about it one more scientific level, like exclusion anxiety was the thing the researchers in this study were using to sort of wield the discussion. And that tests very well. And again, you all would know much better about how to talk about that than I, but I think this is an interesting point. And not one that I, advertising girl, can do. You know what I mean? I'm not going to have a lot of credibility being all, ooh, the exclusion anxiety that results from a lifetime, right? But you can. So, an opportunity. So I don't know if that slide where I showed you the ad again with the red box of all those words we're not supposed to say struck anybody as kind of, I don't know, gross, right? Okay, racism, but don't say that because that's a scary, dangerous word. That does not feel right. That does not sit well. It does not sit well with me. It would not have sat well with Gisela Konopka because pretty much what they're saying is, you know, racism, yeah, don't go there. Don't talk about that. Don't name it. Don't do it. And I get it. I see why they're suggesting it, right? I get the mental shortcut deal. Totally get it. I get politically that the minute you start doing that, you're doing the us-them thing, right? Identity politics. Oh, feminism is anti-man, right? That's the path that these things go by, and that's why I have this giant fence in the slide. But is there another way around this and to think about it? If you are, like me, because of my experiences with Gisela Konopka and my peers, interested in sort of the social justice issues that surround what we're talking about here. And I got a lot of enlightenment from a group called the Applied Research Center. They are a social justice training and organization. They produce a web site called Color Lines, if you're interested. And our trainer at this training, here was his quote. He said, basically, if you're not going to name it, we're never going to address it. And so I've struggled with, on the one hand, my field, the communications researchers saying, don't go there, and the social justice community saying, if you don't go there, we're not going to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. And frankly, have we made a lot of progress on this front? Are we having a lot of national conversations about race, even in the event of the Trayvon Martin trial? But you're going to see it. And here's what I see as the way through. Use those place-based discussions and strategies as a way to get in and illuminate the sort of structural or systemic evidence of racism that we see. This Atlantic City's, look at the masthead there, Atlantic City's Place Matters. Right? And this is the kind of article and research that they're really interested in finding, funding, and promoting. Place Not Race may better explain America's health disparities. And what this researcher is going in and looking at is why, or trying to examine how super segregated neighborhoods have even higher levels of disparity and versus like other neighborhoods that are equally high levels of poverty, but they're integrated, different kinds of people of color with white people all living together, still high levels of poverty. The disparities are much higher in the super segregated communities than in the more integrated communities. So that's a way to look at and start talking about both things at one time, right? Because you're looking at place, right? You're talking about it from a place perspective, but you're still getting into, well, what's the structural difference here? Would it have anything to do with structural racism, perhaps? So that, I think, is a great way to see, to get in. And as I was preparing this, I kind of wanted to do more infant mortality than teen pregnancy, which is what I usually do. Again, interesting that this study popped up almost immediately from segregated spaces, risky places, the effect of racial segregation on health inequalities. And this is a contrast between infant mortality rates and levels of segregation, and showing how much it changes depending on the level of integration. So again, I'll leave it to you to look at this research and see how this tracks or doesn't track with what makes sense to you, but directionally this is what we're talking about. Now, I haven't connected the dot yet, have I? What does place necessarily have to do with structural or institutional racism? And again, that's where it sort of gets interesting. When you look at our recent history, I don't need to go back to slavery to talk about this, in terms of racial redlining. Who has heard of racial redlining? Okay, we all look around. Put your hands back up. That's 7 people in this audience. 7 people in this audience. My anxiety, this is not unique. Again, even in public health audiences, there'll be maybe 4 hands that are raised when we bring this up with racial redlining. So the history goes like this, and if anyone else wants to do this, 30 seconds, other than me. Okay. The quote sort of says it all. But back in the day, after the war, when we were having a big housing boom, our cities and our communities and our government started to draw maps of where investments and loans, et cetera, would go to guide the financial institutions as they gave away our government money, right, to support housing and urban development. And these are the kind of maps they drew. And they literally drew lines saying, this is where we're going to put, in this case, the Negro slum, or this is where African Americans will live, because it's undesirable property. Further, the mortgage lenders were required to adhere to that. They were required to only give loans to African Americans in this neighborhood and not white people, or only white people in this neighborhood and not African Americans. Structural, systemic implementation of racism. Again, this is history, yes? History, not happening today. Fast forward to the mortgage lending crisis, right? And the high levels of foreclosure, short sales, et cetera, in the same neighborhoods as we're drawn with the racial redlining. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but it seems to me that since we know the health disparities cluster in these very neighborhoods, we should be paying attention to these structures and these systems and these places. And again, because people don't think about it, I'm looking to us, the folks that are invested in addressing health disparities, to bring it up. So the recommendation, and this came from the Applied Research Center, was to really don't use just the word racism. That, again, is an elephant that defaults to individuals with racist attitudes. Describe it. Talk about structural racism. They give examples around racial profiling, environmental racism, and racial redlining. And again, when it gets into science, that focus on segregation and the impacts of segregation, I think, becomes relevant to you all here. I wanted to show you one way I handled this sort of tension with the state of Minnesota's epidemiologist. We were putting together this page in a publication that we created, and it was supposed to talk about the health disparities inherent in chlamydia rates, because nationally, you know how I was saying 1 in 2 young women has a STD, and it's chlamydia. 1 in 4 with African American young women, it's 1 in 2. 50% with chlamydia. And so when you look at the rates of chlamydia in Minnesota and you queue them up by race, again, it is really scary. It's like triple, right? And when you look at this page, and I know you can't see it very well, I do not have a chart on here that shows the dramatic rate differences. There was literally no way, in my opinion, that a white middle class, or let's just go middle class reader of this page was not going to read it and say, wow, those black girls really need to get it together, right? There was just no way. So again, this was a very nice collaboration with the epidemiologist, and I say collaboration because it was a little tension-filled sometimes. We came to the agreement that we put that data, it had to be there, right? We put that data in the copy, and what we did instead was showed the changing demographics in the state of Minnesota. Another reason for that is a framing reason, different talk. But what you see, that picture of the girl, and I put it on your handout too. We were looking for ways to talk about how the structural or systemic stuff impacts health and health care without, being too direct and using this framing advice. And this is from Wisconsin, and what they're looking at here is, their analysis of what comprises a health outcome. And they've divided it up into clinical care, health behaviors, physical environment, and social and economic factors. So again, this was a way for us to say there's more involved here than the individual behavior of given one teenage girl. The other little thing that you see there with the house and the dollar bills, again, trying to illuminate the structural challenges, highlights the lending practices and how wealth and lending is disparate in terms of how loans are given out. So that's what gets highlighted there. So that's it applied in a public health environment. I get frustrated, and I haven't made a point of bringing this up today, but finding the data to support these stories is challenging. Even in the public health community, there's much more focus and emphasis on individual behaviors than there are the larger systems and structures. So I had the privilege of teaching a 1-credit class this summer for public health students about this very topic, and their assignment to get their credit was to go find me research and references that linked together this story, right? Health outcomes, structural, systematic issues, and racism. And at my blog, which is listed on your handout, you will see their work. The first 2 blog posts have their responses, and it's a citation, a brief description, and a link to where it is. So if you're curious to see what they did with it, go check it out. And they would be tickled if somebody contacted them. I'd freak them out, but that would be awesome. All right, so conclusion. What am I asking you to do exactly? If you buy into this idea that you have a responsibility to communicate in such a way that we start shaping and changing public perceptions around this issue, here's what I would suggest. We've got to frame these issues, right? We've got to frame it. And by that, I mean emphasize the external factors over the individual focus. Just like I said, that first thing with my auntie, right? Can I get my auntie to stop talking about that bad mother and start looking at what is it about that neighborhood that's where all this stuff is happening? What neighborhood? Hospitals, clinics? Are there doctors? What kind of food is there? Is there pollution? What is it about that neighborhood as opposed to that mom's behaviors? So that's communications to change public perceptions. If you're going to do materials, if you're going to do websites or blog posts or tweets or whatever it is, I kind of have to here buy in with the framing recommendation that leading with racism is not going to lead you into an effective message. If it's on paper or documented, you can't tell the story. You get one shot and they're gone. So that's where I pull back. And if I am going to do it, I suggest it's always qualified. We never just lead with racism as the issue. We lead with structural racism or environmental racism or racial profiling or whatever it is. And then finally, personal engagement. This is where I kind of get hardcore. It's very easy as a white person who's lived a life of privilege to not even see this stuff, to not see it. I mean, it took years of this sort of talk and Gisela infiltration in my brain to sit in a meeting and look around and be like, holy cats, we're talking about chlamydia disparities and there's not one person of color in this room. So seeing it for me is critical, step number one. Naming it, right? Being brave enough to be the advertising lady in the room and be like, hi, there's no people of color here. Should we be discussing that? Investigate it. That's what you all do, not what I do. But we need you. We need you to be investigating so we have this stuff to draw on and look at. And finally, talk about it. Again, as a white person, does the Trayvon Martin ruling and sentence and experience impact me? Do I talk about it? Is my family talking about it? Are my peers talking about it? This is the stuff I want to ask because I really think that by elevating attention and talking about it, we're going to move this boat forward. So that was my sort of pushy professional recommendation for you all. Thank you for bearing with it. Nobody threw anything. That's good. Take it a little step further since nobody did throw anything at me. That's my big message is everybody go out there, talk about this stuff. You've got to talk about it. Rah, rah. Other people are doing this too. I came across this group and it's called Showing Up for Racial Justice. And it was I was trying to pursue what is the way for white people to talk about Trayvon Martin because I'm a white person. And they're doing the same thing. Check this out. We want to see 1 million conversations by white people about race in the next year. Cool. So again, I put that on there. They have a whole toolkit. And I'm not trying to exclude people of color from this conversation and what's going on. I just think you're probably having more of these conversations than white people are right now, so not as much urging. And that's the private conversation. Is there another way to take this within your professional associations? And I would suggest, yeah. Should this discussion about racism be something that rises to the top when you all are working to discuss disparities? And I know my little screenshots here are not a scientific method, but it was real easy for me to find that in pediatrics, the discussion about media use as a health concern is much more prevalent than the discussion of racism. The numbers here I have is 730 versus 208. Again, not very scientific, but still trying to make my point that you all can bring this issue into the agenda because you're part of that community. So those were my formal remarks. Oh, it's exactly 1:15. I would be happy to answer any questions or take pushback. We didn't have a lot of time for that engagement today, but you really welcome that pushback. So if you want to, stick around or whatever, and I'm happy to do it. Thank you very much for being here today. Anybody questions? Pushback? Yes, Marla.
Thank you, Glynis. This is a fabulous talk. And the thing that I'm thinking about is your tested language, the language that was in green, say this instead of that. What it's making me think of this is kind of the changing, ever-changing, politically correct way that we refer to this or that. And I'm wondering if this new tested language is just that it's something different that people haven't talked about very much. That we really need this thing. That's a trigger word.
Right.
And are we just constantly trying to stay one step ahead of how we talk about things, maybe to confuse people enough that they don't jump to their trigger words that have these automatic frames like you described?
Absolutely. About 4 fascinating facts in your comment there. One is the basic frames and values that shape those mental shortcuts do change and evolve over time, slowly, right? Where advertisers are much more sensitive to sort of topical things, these framers believe that this stuff is entrenched and salient. So yes and no on that part of it. Are these buzzwords, is this sort of a political correct thing, and will people eventually morph over into needing new words and stuff? Probably, maybe, I don't know. My goal is to use these words so that people do start automatically thinking about this differently, and then I don't need to do that hoop jumping anymore. Is that the case? Will that be the case? I don't know. There are really good case studies, though. For example, the Frameworks Institute worked really hard on early childhood education funding in the state of Minnesota. And that's when the discussion was they changed the discussion from daycare to early childhood education. And we don't have that debate in Minnesota much anymore, do we? There's no, I'm not paying for those kids' daycare. It's, in Minnesota, we pay for early childhood education. So that's an instance where it did trigger enough to make it work. On bad days, though, I totally hear what you're saying. I totally hear what you're saying. What else? Iris.
So, when you do a research project, it used to be that you'd always include race kind of as one of your variables. Just, because of course you wanted to include that as just a basic demographic variable. And I think there's been kind of a push from the scientific community to say, hey, before you just, think about looking at whatever you're looking at by race, think about why, justify why you're getting to that. And so I just wondered from your vantage point in that kind of reporting of findings, what advice you'd give, just thinking about when it's a good thing to do.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that question. A couple of answers to that become interesting. That chlamydia page that I showed you, right? Not showing that actual data on that page was critical because of who my audience was and where I wanted them to go, right? Are there other audiences where showing that data and that breakdown by race is super critical? Absolutely, right? The African American community vitally needs, wants that information, and probably broken down as far as you guys can do it, right? So for me, it's not do you collect it or do you have it? It's once we have it, how do we use it most effectively? Because again, with chlamydia, we're not going to do that here, but step number 2 ought to be let's go talk to the African American community, show them this data, see how they want it presented and packaged so that they can do their work here, as opposed to, again, us dictating what the terms of that are. The second thing that I found out, again, it's just not my professional orientation, but it's fascinating to me, is there's a whole social justice movement wrapped up in how you are collecting that racial data, right? Because the clumping of the groups and the need for you to clump further for statistical significance is super problematic. And so particularly I think it's in Oregon, they've got these groups who are really trying to stand behind and empower communities of color to jump in and work with the research community to say, no, let's try this new way of identifying ourselves, identifying our race and ethnicity. And so it's super empowering, and it's changing the way the researchers interact. So it's fascinating. Did I get there? Okay. Hi.
I just have a question about the apology factor or just finding balance. And part of the work that I got to do when I was at Gonzaga had to do with, the study of whiteness and just how much that colors what we do and whatnot. And the piece of work that was presented to us was a person of color that was becoming a physician. And everybody had to try and work with this individual as they were trying to go through the research and documentation and actually presenting the paper quality. And my question didn't have anything to do with whiteness. I wanted to know whether he had knowledge and skill sets and capability in order to continue the medical practice. And it just seemed to me like there was this entire emphasis put over here when the moment really was about knowledge, skill set, and quality of this person moving forward as a physician. And we spent an enormous amount of time looking at our whiteness and justifying why he couldn't do what was being asked of him. And so, I mean, I totally understand, get it, Hispanic female, only one in my family with the master's, blah, 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 blah. And I've had to figure out a lot of stuff in my life. Teen mom, not me, my mother. What I'm trying to understand is when I go into the field and I'm working with different families, the balance. There just seems to be always this apology factor if you've been raised in a place where you're a person that has had a chance.
Right.
Has been given whatever.
Yeah.
And just social justice, and then it's like, you're way over here, and I'm still sitting there going, can the female firefighter lift the person out of the building to save a life?
Right. You just really clearly articulated another element I didn't go with today, and that was one of the barriers these folks have uncovered to even having these discussions is that apologeticness. That there's this general, people that kind of get into this topic, right? If you're a white person or coming from privilege, you're so wrapped up in your own, that apology stuff, right? That you can't get around it to have the conversations that I think you're talking about wanting to have. And they...
this person will live or die. Can you do it or not?
Yeah. No, exactly. And again... So I don't have the best answer in the world for you. I think some of our social justice friends would, and so I would direct you to their website to take a look at it. But again, I get challenged and kind of inflamed by that idea of, are there purely binary solutions to this stuff that because of how I am set up, I make the shortcut to, hey, wait, it's whether that woman can lift the sack or not. Is that really the issue? Isn't the issue whether those 4 people can lift the sack? Do you know what I mean? So that's where it gets kind of interesting, fascinating to me. So we should keep talking because I think that's an ongoing challenge and struggle. Thank you. What else? Anything else? All right. Again, thank you. Professional high point for me today. You all made it possible, so thank you very much. Woohoo.